early on in my career. And so without further ado, I'm going to present today on medical worker migration and origin country human capital, evidence from US visa policy. And this work is joined with Caroline Theoridis from Amherst College. And I'm really looking forward to an interesting discussion later and your comments. So many developed countries, including the United States, face a shortage of medical workers, particularly of nurses. And to fill these gaps, these countries often recruit foreign-born nurses. Yet, despite the many benefits of migration to origin countries, say in the form of remittances and other things, many fear that such recruitment may lead to scarcity or what we call the brain drain. And indeed, there's this very long literature, a theoretical literature in economics that warns of like the really bad consequences of high-skilled immigration. Skilled migrants don't contribute as much to the tax system of the origin country. Skilled immigrants lead to bad economic performance, and basically when skilled migrants leave, they take away their positive externalities when they deport. And central to these arguments is really the assertion that skilled migration inevitably leads to a depleted stock of skilled workers in the origin country. So you can imagine like it's like oil, which you extract, and then there's not enough natural resource left. But in contrast, more recent and alternative models of human capital formation propose that immigration and high-skilled migration may lead to investments in skills so large that the impact on skill stocks is ambiguous or might even be positive or a brain gain. Because not everybody can migrate or will migrate in the end. But credible evidence on this has been scarce. So in this paper, we're going to address the causal question. What is the effect of demand for foreign-born healthcare workers on the stock of healthcare workers in the origin country? And we'll also look at the effect of this foreign demand on the overall level of educated labor in the country of origin. And so to do this, we're going to exploit a pair of plausibly exogenous policy shocks. And the first policy change occurred in 2000 when the US dramatically expanded the availability of visas for foreign nurses. And I'll refer to this period as the visa expansion period. And then in 2007, visas suddenly reduced to pre-2000 levels. And then I'll refer to this policy change as the visa contraction. And so what this did was it altered the migration prospects of nurses, especially from the Philippines, because the Philippines is the largest migrant origin country for nurses. Filipinos make up 40% of foreign-born nurses, for example, in the US. And so we're going to examine the effect of this international migration of nurses on both the demand for and supply of education. And in particular, we'll look at the post-secondary enrollment and graduation. And then we'll also look at effects on the supply of nursing programs. And then we'll look at, if we have time, the pass rates on the nursing licensing exam. So we're going to use an event study methodology, which compares historically high versus low nurse migrant origin provinces before and after the policy changes. And so what this does is it leverages migrant networks as an important determinant of where and in what occupation migrants work. So effectively, what we're arguing here is that the policy changes should have disproportionately impacted historically high nurse migrant origin areas as opposed to historically low nurse migrant origin areas. And so you can think about it as the former being the treatment group and the latter being the control group. And so if you compare outcomes from the treated areas to the control areas before and after the policy changes, then we can estimate the causal impact of international migration and outcomes. And I can discuss this empirical strategy more later and how we deal with potentially confounding factors. All right, so a preview of my results in case I run out of time. We find that the expansion and contraction of US nursing visas first increased and then decreased migration of Filipino nurses. And this serves as the first stage for us, showing that the high nurse migrant provinces were in fact affected by the policy changes. And then in terms of nursing enrollment, we will find that this increased substantially after the visa expansion, then decreased when visas were reduced. And then similarly, nursing graduation responded, but the response had a 4-year lag because it takes 4 years to obtain a nursing degree in the Philippines, and this is required for international migration. And just very briefly, I wanted to highlight the inverted U-shaped pattern of our results following the 2 policies changes. The exact timing of the increase and decrease in education is difficult to attribute to alternative hypotheses and other concerns about differential province-specific trending. And then in terms of the supply of nursing programs, we find that these increased to allow for new enrollment. And interestingly, the response was largely concentrated among private schools. Private schools make up 85% of nursing programs in the Philippines. And in particular, the response was concentrated among private schools without previously existing nursing programs. So you can think of it like as a private institution like Ateneo doesn't have a nursing program. And in response to the policy change and the increased demand for nursing education, it opens up a nursing program rather than having new schools open up entirely. And I think this is important to highlight, to contextualize our results, because it was important that the provinces were able to respond in terms of supply. And I'll talk more about this in a while. So our results suggest a huge brain gain, at least in terms of nurses in the country. Our estimates imply that for every 1 new nurse migrant, there were 9 newly licensed nurses that were produced in the country and that stayed in the country. And then in terms of the licensure exam, lots and lots of people took the exam and many passed it, as reflected by the 9 newly licensed nurses. But that said, we find that the impact of the policy changes was that there were lower pass rates in the exam. But overall, we still find an increase in the stock of licensed nurses. And so overall, you might ask, well, what about overall brain drain or gain? Sure, we found that the stock of human capital for nurses increased, but what about the stock of human capital overall in all fields of study? And so we examined the effects of the policy changes on enrollment and graduation in other degree programs to determine whether the policy changes spurred new students to obtain education or instead just caused students to shift from other fields of study. And so we find that our effects are largely driven by individuals switching to nursing from other fields of study. But nevertheless, we find evidence that the switching individuals persisted to graduation at a higher rate than they would have otherwise, resulting in an overall increase in the human capital stock in the Philippines. And I will show these results later. All right, so as for our contributions, we provide the first causal microeconomic estimates of the effects of medical worker migration on origin human capital. And this provides support for models of brain gain I talked earlier about, and builds upon evidence of brain gain in other settings found by these studies. But our study is different in that we focus on skill-specific migration, the migration of nurses, where the supply of post-secondary education may not readily respond. So for example, policy-wise, people fear that brain drain is more severe in specialized occupations like nursing because it might be harder to train these workers. But we document that a brain gain is possible in a specialized field. We measure supply side effects, as I previewed earlier on. And then we use this unique data that allow us for very accurate estimates of skill prior to migration. In fact, we capture all the universe of migrant departures in the time period that we consider. And I can talk more about that data shortly. More broadly, our paper provides an empirical test of human capital theory given an exogenous increase in the returns to education. We test the theory dating back to Becker, which, as you recall, posits that investments in education should respond to the returns to education. And so we provide a well-identified test of this theory in a migration setting. So key to our findings is that the supply of schooling was able to accommodate increased demand. And as an important caveat here, I want to mention that such a response may not be possible in all contexts. I think it's worth noting that the supply response was due to existing institutions adding programs. And so for countries with established post-secondary systems, adding these sorts of programs may prove easier and may present fewer hurdles than opening up entirely new institutions to respond to the foreign demand for workers. And so I think where our research sheds light is for low to middle income countries seeking to use migration as a development tool, for example, like the Philippines or other countries like Indonesia, Nepal, Bangladesh. And I think our results provide evidence that these countries may experience an increase in the human capital stock and domestic supply of healthcare workers. And there is some scope for well-designed partnerships between migrant origin and migrant receiving countries as a result. I usually pause here for any questions, but since we're reserving questions for later on, I guess I can just continue and we can just gather those questions in the chat. I don't think I need to talk about the background on Filipino nurse migration as much for this audience, but the Philippines is, one of the largest migrant origin countries in the world. It's one of those countries that pursues migration as an active development strategy. There are many other countries definitely that seek to do the same thing. Indonesia, Nepal, Bangladesh, and a lot of these countries facilitate migration for migrants to go abroad and then come back home, like the Philippines. But in this context, we're not going to think of this kind of temporary circular migration. We're going to think about permanent migration, where individuals are planning to move from the Philippines to the US and then stay there. And the data we are going to use will actually be all on permanent migrants. Filipino nurses make up the largest group of foreign-born nurses in the world. And this is rooted essentially in the colonial relationship of the country with the US. And essentially during their time here, the US set up numerous nursing schools. And these nursing schools were developed to resemble institutions in the US in terms of curriculum, training, and culture. And so as a result, the US remains the most common destination of Filipino migrant nurses. 74% of migrant nurses go to the US, in fact. It's really attractive to move abroad as a nurse to the US. We document that Filipino nurses earn over 13 times higher salaries plus legal status for family members if they're able to migrate. And then I just want to highlight this really nice book by the historian Catherine Choi, in which she argues that migrant networks are actually a key determinant of migration patterns, especially for nurses, because networks are facilitated in the schools themselves at many times. So as for US recruitment of nurses, the most common channel for nurses to go abroad is through permanent employment-based visas, which is EB3 visas. There are 140,000 of these every year. It's capped at that level. And nursing is considered a Schedule A occupation, which means that it's an occupation where there are shortages in the US economy. And so nurses experience shorter processing times of their visas as a result. But as a standard, the Philippines can't receive more than 7% of the EB3 visas, and that's just by law. And this constraint is always binding for the Philippines. The Philippines always reaches the 7% cap, and so the demand for these visas far exceeds the supply. So in terms of the policy changes we'll look at here, the first is the American competitiveness in the 21st century Act of 2000, AC 21, which effectively loosened per country limits and on visa app allocation. So there were approximately 200,000 additional visas that were given to Schedule A occupations all at once, of which I mentioned earlier that nursing is one of those occupations. However, in 2007, the processing of these Schedule A visas stopped. It went from about 6,800 nursing visas that were processed in the Philippines to about 2,300 visas in from 2006 to 2007. So this reversal was sudden and unanticipated. And we actually have some nice quotes in the paper from immigration officials talking to US Congress, saying that they couldn't have predicted this abrupt change. And in fact, they had no idea how many visas were even available in the first place. So we think that we are justified here in thinking that these policy shocks were plausibly exogenous policy shocks, at least to the Filipinos who were deciding to make decisions on education. All right, so let me show briefly what this looks like in our data. Here we plot the number of departures of both nurse and non-nurse migrants. The black line with circles shows migrants to the US. And you can see it peaks in 2006, and then we have this dramatic fall in 2007. And the visa policies didn't affect non-nurse migrants, as you can see from the dashed line. And then you can also see non-US nurse migrants, dotted line. And this is relatively flat during the period of visa expansion. And then we see a slight uptick starting in around 2008, 2009, which is when demand from Canada increased for these for the nurses from the Philippines after the contraction of visas in the US. So brain drain or brain gain. So the Philippines provides a really compelling example, I think, of where one might anticipate a shortage of domestically employed nurses. Given the large numbers of nurses that go abroad, this is where you would probably expect to find a brain drain, if ever. So indeed, a lot of policymakers during this time were expecting as much when the US expanded the visas, were really ramping up their recruitment of nurses. The DOH secretary at that time said that sadly, this is no longer a brain drain, but more appropriately a brain hemorrhage of our nurses. The Philippines will be bled dry of nurses. But despite this fear, let me show you some aggregate post-secondary enrollment and graduate data that suggest an opposite result. And this is directly from my data, not doing any sort of fancy econometrics, but just plotting the data over time on enrollments and graduations. So here are the aggregate numbers. This graph shows the 4-year enrollment in nursing and other degree programs. And you see the following, following the visa expansion in 2000, we went from a 4-year enrollment of about 90,000 individuals in nursing programs to a peak of over 400,000 individuals enrolling in these programs in 2006. And this is a huge, huge response. And then if we look at other fields, it appears like maybe there's some switching behavior going on in the aggregate, at least, where we see declines following the visa expansion. And then following the visa construction, nursing enrollment decreased. We see similar results in terms of graduations. We only have graduation data back until 1998. And the graduates, of course, you can think of this as, if everybody perfectly persists to graduation, we'd expect that graduation is enrollment divided by 4. And so that's why I have lower numbers here. But we see a similar pattern then in enrollment, except that the response occurs with a 4-year lag. And that's because it takes 4 years to obtain a nursing degree in the Philippines. So nursing graduations peak in about 2009 with about 115,000 individuals graduating from nursing school. So in terms of data, we have unique administrative data in this research. The first set of data come from the CFO, which gives us the data on all permanent migrant departures from 1990 to 2013. All migrants before leaving the Philippines permanently need to register in this agency before they depart. They have to do some departure training classes, and they have to present a certificate from the CFO at the airport before they depart. And I know this for a fact because I had to do this myself in 2008. And this is actually an interesting research for me because I am in the data. I'm a data point in the data set. Um, and so the second set of data are from the CHED. The CHED gives us institution level post-secondary enrollment and graduation data from 1990 to 2013, disaggregated by the program of study. And as a result, we're going to be able to calculate enrollment, graduation rates, number of nursing programs in each province year for all the public and private schools in the Philippines. And then finally, we collected this data on the Philippine nursing licensure exam, giving us the number of examinees and the number of passers by institution in the time period we consider. And we use this to calculate later the pass rates for the province year level. All right. So just briefly on the summary statistics, our sample here is going to be the 74 provinces that have been coded to have consistent boundaries over our 20-year sample period. There are about 75 migrants per 100,000 individuals in an average province. About 4 of those are going to be US nurse migrants. As for enrollment, 25% of the college-age population in the average province enrolls in post-secondary education, with about 2% of that being individuals enrolling in nursing school programs. And this is for our entire period, just to clarify. And then the average province has about 4 nursing programs, and most of it is going to be privately run. So in terms of our empirical strategy, what we'll do is, as I mentioned earlier, exploit the plausibly exogenous and opposite sign policy changes that occurred in 2000 and 2007 that expanded and restricted nurse migration to the US. The national time series results that I showed you earlier provide some suggestive evidence of the impact of these policy changes, but in order to isolate the causal effect, we're going to exploit the importance of migrant networks in an event study framework. And essentially, this is about comparing high baseline nurse migration areas to low baseline nurse migration areas before and after the policy changes. And as I mentioned earlier, this takes advantage of the fact that high nurse migration areas will be disproportionately exposed to these policy changes. And so we can use this group as the treatment group and then compare their outcomes to a control group who we assume will not have been impacted by the policy changes because they have no networks for migration. So in terms of the details of our estimating equation, we use a standard event study equation where YPT is going to be the outcome variable, something like nursing enrollment or graduation. And we regress this on a binary variable equal to 1 if the province has above high median nurse migration at baseline 1990. And then this is interacted with d tau t, which is a binary variable equal to 1 if the year of observation t equals a specific year tau and 0 otherwise. And then we omit 1999 in order to identify the model. And then we have both province and year fixed effects. We also have baseline control variables interacted with the fixed effects, and these are going to control for any confounding factors that are time varying and are correlated between high migration and low nurse migration areas. And then I should mention before I move on that for all specifications, we're also going to estimate what we refer to as a pooled model. And this is going to be more akin to a standard difference in difference model where we're going to estimate the jump that occurs at the exact time of the expansion and then at the exact time of a contraction, and then we'll estimate the annual trends, a linear trend between the 2 periods so that we can sort of do back of the envelope calculations of the magnitude of our impacts. And what this does is it basically allows for easier interpretation of our results and increased statistical precision because we are estimating fewer parameters in the model. Okay, so you might doubt our empirical strategy. So in terms of the identifying assumption, in order for our model to capture the causal effect, the assumption is that high nurse migration provinces would not have experienced differential changes in outcomes compared to low nurse migration provinces in the absence of policy changes. And this is something we can check. If this assumption holds, we shouldn't reject the null hypothesis that the betas prior to 2000 are equal to 0. And what that means is that the trend in outcomes of the high nurse migration provinces should be pretty much the same as the low nurse migration provinces in the periods before the policy change. And that would give us some evidence that our identifying assumption holds. Just very quickly on some threats to validity of this design. First, we're concerned about potential differential trending of outcomes between high and low nurse migration provinces. I already mentioned that we're going to have province level fixed effects to account for the difference in levels. We'll have baseline controls interacted with your year fixed effects to reduce concerns about like time varying, spurious, omitted variables. And we're going to find no evidence of pre-trends, as I discussed earlier. And I also think it's worth noting again that our dual policy changes yield an inverted U-shaped pattern of results that I think will be difficult to explain with any alternative hypothesis to our theory. And another point perhaps mentioning is that non-nursing disciplines declined in enrollment during the visa expansion. And so if you thought that our results are driven by something else other than migration, then maybe a simultaneous policy change in education, then we wouldn't have expected that to only affect nursing outcomes in our data. Another concern you might have is cross-province migration. And in particular, if individuals are moving from low migration provinces and enrolling in post-secondary education in high nurse migration provinces. And so this might bias our results to find that migration impacted education, while what it really impacted was just, internal migration. But just to allay your fears about this concern, we just find very low rates of migration for education from low to high nurse migration provinces in our data. And then we also use these bounding exercises where we assume the worst case scenario where, all of the internal migration was because of enrollment in education. And we find that, even assuming the worst case scenario, that such internal migration will really explain only a trivial portion of our effects. So other threats to validity, other policy changes correlated with both nurse migration and outcome variable. We collected all major changes to the healthcare system and healthcare legislation that occurred during this time. And there were no changes that happened simultaneously to the policy changes that we are examining. And then as for our robustness checks, we've done a lot of things, and we've done a check where we run our results without Manila, because Manila is an outlier in terms of both migration and enrollment in education. Our results are robust to dropping Manila. Our results are robust to additional baseline controls. And then another concern relates to some referees and journals have asked us to show results using a continuous treatment variable rather than a binary treatment variable for high and low nurse migration provinces. And we've done that as well, and our results are robust to doing that specifications as well. So I'm not going to show all of these in this presentation, but you can find that in the research paper. All right, so on to our results. So now I'm going to be able to show you pictures of our estimates. So here you're going to look at the effect of the visa expansion and contraction on first the nurse migrants per 100,000 individuals. So the solid black line here plots the event study estimates. The dotted lines are the 95% confidence interval, and then the dashed lines shows the pooled event study estimates that I mentioned earlier, and it nicely corresponds to our event study estimates. And we've denoted in vertical lines the exact timing of the visa expansion and the visa construction in 2000 and 2007. So what you can see here is that following the 2000 expansion, nurse migration started to increase in high relative to low nurse migration provinces. And then following the visa contraction in 2007, there's this sharp drop suddenly in nurse migrants to the US. And so this confirms to us like that, the policy changes, in fact, impacted nurse migration for the Philippines. We find a slight downtrend as a pre-trend to pre-2000, but it's the opposite sign, and it's much smaller in magnitude than our main results, that it wouldn't really bias our results if there's this differential trending in our results. So our results confirm that the US visa policy did in fact impact migration to the US. And in terms of magnitude, the average effect of the expansion was to increase nurse migrants per capita, nurse migrants per 100,000 individuals by 3.9. Or in terms of percentages, it was a 126% increase from the pre-period mean of nurses. On to the effects on nursing enrollment. What you can see here is a similar pattern of results from what we saw in the aggregate earlier. There was an increase following the visa expansion and then a decrease following the visa contraction. And I want to note here that this is for enrollment in 4 years in college. And so there's a slow drop off from the visa construction period. And this is due to individuals finishing their degrees over that 4-year period and not just, immediately dropping out from education. And so as you see, as I've stressed earlier, there's this inverted U-shaped pattern that is, again, difficult to explain due to differential trending or other alternative hypotheses. And in terms of magnitude, we estimate that the expansion period increased nursing enrollment by 1.74 percentage points, or an increase in nurse enrollment of 129% from the pre-period mean. So these marginal nurse enrollees will not contribute to the supply of nurses in the Philippines if they don't persist on to graduation. So my next slide is looking at the impacts of the policy changes to nurse graduation rates. So here we see a similar pattern of results, but results that occur with a 4-year lag to the policy changes. It's the same story. The average effect in the expansion period is about a 0.39 percentage point increase in the nursing graduation rate in high relative to low nurse migration provinces, or a 247% increase in the number of nursing graduates. So essentially, these are very large effects. So taking stock of these magnitudes, the visa expansion led to a 247% increase in graduates. This implies that for every additional nurse migrant, there were 21 additional nursing graduates. And this is a huge impact. But to put this in some context, you want to recall the aggregate response earlier. Nurse migrants went from about 1,200 in 1999 to 7,300 in 2006. But nurse graduates went from 11,000 in 2002 to around 113,000 in 2009. So right before the policy change. So it's worth noting here again that what we're going to show you is that these individuals switch between programs, and so excuse me. Let me just drink water for a second. And so the parameter we're going to estimate here is going to be the elasticity of overall, is not going to be the elasticity of overall educational migration, because this is going to be education specific. And so it might be more elastic to switch between programs than to actually enroll in nursing education. So that gives some context to why this is a huge effect. And then, for those who really don't believe our results and believe that we probably made a mistake in our estimates, we also include these this kind of back of the envelope calibration of a standard utility function, showing that, under reasonable levels of risk aversion, many individuals are actually going to shift to nursing despite the very low probability of actually actual nurse migration, because the returns to migration are just very large. So this is our way of justifying our results to show that it's actually quite reasonable given some level of risk aversion for the population. All right. So what about the supply of schooling? So there's a common argument here that even if the returns to schooling could induce enrollment by individuals, that supply constraints could bind, because schools just might not be able to accommodate the increased demand for education of these students. And it's often been stated in the literature that this is particularly likely for specialized occupations like doctors or nurses, because these people are just harder. These people are just harder to train in these occupations. And so what we're able to do here is explicitly test for this. Because of our data, we are able to examine the effect of the policy changes on the number of nursing programs in the Philippines. And so here are our event study results showing the effect of the policy changes on the supply of nursing programs. And you can see that starting in 2000, nursing programs start to increase quite dramatically in high nurse migrant areas relative to low nurse baseline migration areas. And the average increase in the expansion period is about 1 nurse program relative to the pre-period mean of about 4 programs. And this is driven mostly by private institutions. 85% of nursing programs in the Philippines are private. So, and that's what's driving this response. And I'll go over these results in the next few slides, and it's almost entirely driven, our evidence indicates, by institutions adding programs, existing institutions adding programs, rather than new institutions opening up. So this is what I've been mentioning. We want to think about these effects in terms of how they interact with the post-secondary supply elasticity of education in the provinces. And so what we're going to use as our measure of supply elasticity is the share of private institutions without nursing programs out of the total private institutions in the province. And the reason we're going to use this is that having more private institutions without nursing programs should indicate that there's more a potential margin for response, rather than if you already have a nursing program and it's hard, because it's harder to build to start a new institution totally from the ground to cater to the demand for nursing education. And so what we do here is just we split our sample by above and below median supply elasticity provinces, and then we conduct our analysis, and the same analysis as we've done. And so what we find here is that our results are almost entirely driven by the places with more elastic supply, the graph on the left. And so what this points out is that the key in order to find the brain gain effects that we find here is that this didn't require entirely new institutions to open up, but it did require the ability to expand upon existing institutions. And so I think this is going to help us contextualize our results and see how it applies to other contexts and in other countries. Okay, so now what happened on the quality of nurse enrollments and graduations? And so we look at this, and our proxy for quality is going to be the nurse licensure pass rates. And I don't think I have much time to talk about these results, but the conclusion is that examinees passed the nursing licensure exams at a lower rate in high relative to low nurse provinces. But because so many more people took the exam, that licensed nurses increased substantially in net, even with lower pass rates for these nurses. And what we show is that there were 9 nurses for every new migrant. Okay, so migration increased the number of nurses in the Philippines, but you might ask, what happened to the overall stock of college-educated labor or human capital in the country? And so we also look at the effect of the policy changes on non-nursing enrollment. And we see this decline in non-nursing enrollment after the visa expansion for nurses. And on the right panel, we see that total enrollment is largely flat. And so the conclusion here is actually that it appears that the policy change, the visa expansion, did not increase total enrollment in the Philippines, but it induced individuals to shift their field of study towards migration. So it was not as if there were new, the marginal students were induced to enroll in education, but our response was mainly people changing their fields of study to nursing from other degree types. But in terms of persistence to graduation, our policy changes does appear to have affected persistence. On the left, you see the effects on non-nursing graduation, on the non-nursing graduation rate. We actually don't find any effects on the non-nursing graduation rate, but on the graduation rate, it appears that nursing degrees, students who are studying nurses were more likely to persist to graduation. And we find post-expansion effects on total graduation to be jointly statistically significant. So this would suggest that an overall stock of human capital in the Philippines actually increased as a whole because more of these students that switched actually persisted to graduation at a higher rate. Okay, so we often get this question a lot: what happens to nursing graduates who do not get a visa? And we don't really have solid evidence on this, solid data on this, but we have some suggestive evidence. We find that a very small share of them migrate as nurses to other destinations from our data. And it also appears that they're not absorbed by temporary contracts. And we have this other data set on the universe of temporary migrant departures to confirm this. Our analysis of the census suggests that there was a large increase in nurse employment in the Philippines, about an 85% increase in nurse employment. And we think it's largely coming from these other programs that we found out about, the RN Heals program, where they take licensed nurses, say in Manila or Cebu, in one of their major cities, and then they get them jobs for 6 months and then move them to other places in the country or possibly even underserved areas and work there. What about those that do not pass? This is the people, we don't really have solid data on this, but there's some suggestive evidence that these people worked as public health associates or universal healthcare implementers, where they presumably have some knowledge of basic hygiene, and so we're able to work on some capacity related to health. And there's also some nice qualitative evidence suggesting that actually, part of this boom in nursing graduations helped the business processing outsourcing industry, because they basically absorbed all these new people who were trained and who graduated as nursing but didn't pass the licensure exams and so couldn't practice as nursing. So I think I'm a little bit over time, so let me just wrap this up. In terms of welfare, to take stock, what are the benefits? The Philippines gained nurses according to our data. Those who migrated experienced presumably huge gains in wages and possibly sent remittances to the Philippines. And then in terms of costs, many nurses remained unemployed or in volunteer positions because, and these are individuals who switched to nursing from other fields. And so it's really unclear if remaining in those fields would have had a greater development impact on the Philippines or not, right? But ultimately, our paper aims, what our paper has done, and I hope it provides a pretty convincing estimate of the partial equilibrium effects of demand for foreign nurses on education in the country of origin. And at the end of the day, in terms of these overall welfare effects, I think it's a little bit outside the scope of our paper, but hopefully we can shed some light on this in a future research project. So in conclusion, the expanded migration opportunities did not deplete the stock of nurses in the Philippines. Overall supply of nurses and human capital stock increased despite worries of some people. But as a caveat, our results may not translate to all settings. And our results provide useful evidence, we think, for low to middle income countries seeking to facilitate labor migration opportunities. And, here is where, partnerships develop between migrant sending, migrant origin countries and migrant receiving countries should play a huge role. And essentially, the bottom line is that we provide evidence that brain gain can dominate brain drain in the context of medical worker migration. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope this leads. There's still some time for questions, and so I'm once again, thank you so much for having me today. And I'll share my slides and also the link to the paper at some point. And I'd be curious to hear about your comments and discussions.
Okay, thank you very much, Paolo. That was really an interesting presentation and hits closer to home. And we actually have questions already posted in the chat box, but let me call them so that they can ask the question themselves. First from Nandi, who's also, of course, a member of our faculty and former dean of the Department of Economics. Then I'm going to call on Mayre and then Abigail, and then Jeff, also members of the faculty. So Nandi.
Pao, I'm interested in terms of Filipino doctors, because I know some doctors who became nurses in the US. Well, is this really just a minor occurrence, and is there an existing study on migration of Filipino doctors to the US? And do you think the results on nurses will apply also to medical doctors?
Right. And I have heard of these stories as well, of doctors who apply for nurses. But in our data, they really represent a small portion of our migrant departures actually. And I was a little surprised at that, and so that's why we are not very concerned about this in this case. Although, as you bring up, I mean that might be one of the ways in which this killing of individuals, that might be one of the ways that like it could have had negative consequences or costs to the origin country. But in our data, in what we see from the evidence, this was I forget what we estimate from this, but it was really a small percentage of the data that we didn't make a fuss about it. Yeah.
Okay. We have question also, Mayre and Abigail. Mayre first.
Hi, sir. Good evening on your end. I'd like to ask, traditional migration patterns such as the use of networks for migration is becoming less observed in other countries. I have a similar study on that. The increased use of technology in job applications becoming more of the norm, given the adaptability of people these days. How is the scenario, or how does this scenario fit in the U.S. migration system of nurses?
So I mentioned this earlier on, and I mentioned this very briefly in terms of this book by Choi on, it's titled Empire of Care, and there she details how potential nurse migrants, how they migrate abroad. And one of the things she points out, is that the schools facilitate this a lot. You have classmates sending out letters together or sending out their applications together even, and they use a lot of these like previous people who've migrated abroad as resources to migrate. And in terms of economics, there's this huge literature that demonstrates that migration is that networks are really important determinant of migration. I mean, there's this, and even across settings, like for instance, the most examined case is, you know, Mexican worker migration to the US, and they show like that friends and, you know, networks, people in the same hometown even determine like migration. And so that's, and then, you know, there's the other study by my co-author about, you know, Filipinos and networks as well. And you know, I think, and that's why we're justified, I think, here on using and our proxy for migration is basically this kind of like high baseline migration. If there's a history of migration in the area, and then that's that would predict migration later on. And our results actually show that, right? Like the high nurse migration provinces were disproportionately impacted by the policy changes more so than the low nurse migration areas. But you know, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but feel free to should follow up.
Thank you,
Okay.
sir.
Thanks. Another question from Abigail. So Abigail and Myre are the latest additions to the faculty. Abigail, you may unmute and show yourself if you want.
Okay. Hi, Paolo. I'm just wondering, what is the threshold for saying that the result is brain gain and not brain drain, or some other situation? Because I mean, it can be argued that even with human capital stock going up for nursing graduates, healthcare services in the Philippines hardly improved. I mean, in the past 20 years, or if we're talking about early 2000s until now. So, and then a follow-up question to that would be, what is the quality of the supposed brain gain? Because the classic, or the example that I was looking at yesterday was, when I was reading your paper, was there was this paper on the Indian IT sector gaining from migration, even though the probability of migrating to the US for tech engineers or tech workers are higher. So probably that could be a more believable situation of brain gain than Filipino nurses. I mean, there's an oversupply, it seems, of nursing graduates in the Philippines not being able to migrate to the US.
Yeah, that's a good point, and thanks for bringing that up. So I mean, so first of all, I want to mention that, you know, one of the reasons why I hate this term brain gain, actually, or brain drain, is the fact that it's very unclear what it is, right? What is our operational definition of a brain gain? Does it refer to quality? Does it refer to the numbers? In the literature, the definition of brain drain is the number of skilled individuals in the country. So the brain drain is actually that migration decreases the number of, you know, it's operationalized as the number of post-secondary students or post-secondary educated individuals in the country. And so we take that definition literally in our study, and, you know, that's why we estimate graduations and graduates and, you know, human capital stock in that way. And we show that, you know, there's no impact on, we show that there was in fact an increase in the number of people who are getting a post-secondary education and persistent graduation. So that's why we argue that it's the human capital stock is going up. And actually the fear of brain. So actually one part of the paper that got cut, and will probably be another paper in the future, is results on, you know, the impact on human services and health. We estimate the impacts of the policy changes of the migration of nurses actually on health in these provinces. And we actually find that, you know, there was no impact on health. There was no positive impact, and there's no negative impact. And, you know, the brain drain argument is that, you know, the migration of nurses will negatively impact these areas, the origin country. And, you know, we find no evidence of that. And so this leads me to point out that, you know, there are a lot of people who point to the brain drain as, you know, the problem that ails the healthcare system, and in general, there's a lot of people who point to migrants as the cause of a lot of underdevelopment. But in this case, it's likely, and in this case, we have an oversupply of nurses, likely, right? Like the pay for nurses are low, etc. And so the problem here, in fact, I think, is like the other constraints to healthcare, which are like, you know, what is the how is our facilities doing and those other things. And you know, the other thing I'm thinking of right now is maybe the problem is not the supply itself of nurses in the Philippines or the healthcare workers, but rather the distribution in country, right? A lot of healthcare workers are disproportionately in Manila, not in more rural areas. And you know, how do you impact the distribution of that? I mean, this is outside the scope of the study, but you know, the point that we're trying to make here is that the overall supply didn't change. There were no impacts on health outcomes by this migration, even though it was a massive migration. And so, you know, maybe it's not what was commonly feared that was the problem. Yeah.
Okay. Abigail, is there another follow-up?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paolo. We have another question from Jeff Tocanes, another member of the faculty. Jeff, you may show your.
Thank you.
Good morning, Paolo. Congratulations for the excellent. Sorry, that's our dog. So I was able to join late, and maybe you explained this already. So I have two questions. This is the first one. So at the college level, a large share of students enroll in a province where they do not actually live. Many, for example, from the provinces in Luzon and other parts of the country, study in Metro Manila. Yeah. Many in the Visayas go to Iloilo because they have several good medical nursing schools there. This would not be counted as actually migration. But some of the data that you use, including the migration number itself and the population base, those will be based on the actual people who live in the provinces. Is that something you actually adjusted for? That's the first question.
Yeah. So, okay, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Let me just ask the second question. So, the second is aging, which is happening in many developed countries, including the US, have increased the demand for nurses in recent years, including for your period of study. To the extent that these were correlated with the changes in the visa policy in the US, do you think this can affect the magnitude of the impact of the US visa policy that you measure? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for those questions. For the first question, that's a good question. You know, so we estimate the effect on enrollment. So what we have is enrollment at the place of this place that the student is currently living. So our data actually do not. Ideally, what you're saying is that we should estimate our effects on the place of birth of individuals, because individuals might do some internal migration to obtain post-secondary education. And you're right, that might bias our estimates. And I mentioned this a little early in my talk, that we actually try to estimate how many individuals do this kind of internal migration from data on their place of birth and their place of residence now from the census, and find that there's really a relatively low number of people who do this kind of who move from low nurse migration areas to high nurse migration areas. And you know, we did some kind of bounding exercises where we assume the worst case scenario, where we assume that a lot of these there's a lot of this people from low nurse migration provinces who move to high nurse migration provinces, and we show that it explains, you know, just very small portion of our huge effects. So you're right that it's a concern that, you know, this cross province internal migration, but I think we show in the paper that, you know, even if you assume the worst case scenario in this result, that, you know, the result holds. As for your other question on these other policy changes at the same time, we are not aware of any so the problem would be if the policy changes are, you know, exactly at the timing that we look at during 2000 and 2007. And, you know, we're not aware of any kind of visa expansion and visa or any kind of, so first of all, we're not aware of any kind of policy change in the healthcare system in the Philippines that happened coincidental to these policy changes. In terms of simultaneous migration policies, we don't know of any during this period. We all we know is that after 2007, 2008, the migration to Canada starts to pick up. And that's because they changed one of their laws. I forget which one of it was, and it was to sort of to increase specifically nurse migrants to the country. And I think I show this in my aggregate, some of my plots earlier on, where nurse migration picked up, but not as much as the nurse migration to the US. I think I can show that slide too right now. Let me see. Am I still sharing my screen? No, but
not yet.
Let me share that screen. Sorry. Where is it? Fam. Sorry, yeah. Here we find that U.S. nurse migrants went up from starting 2000. Non-U.S. nurse migrants to other destinations basically didn't change until 2007, 2009, I think, and this slight uptick in the end was based on Canada increasing its visas for nurses. But this occurs after our period of interest, so I don't think it would affect our results.
Okay, Jeff, do you have a follow-up question? You're raising your hand.
No, I would just like to clarify with Paolo that students who actually go to another province to study, they will not be counted as internal migrants. So they will not be counted as in the census as part of the internal migration, because it's very temporary. During summer breaks, they will come back, or after they graduate, they will come back.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I mean, if that's the case, then I think we are underestimating our impacts, because what that means is, I don't know what that means in terms of our results. So are you thinking that this would bias our results like upwards or downwards, or? Because we don't really account for internal migration in our estimates. I mean, we are basically assuming that the education the education response was for the people in the province that was affected, was either high or low nurse migration province. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I addressed your question, but we can discuss further later if you want.
It's okay, Paolo. I don't really know how to handle it also. It's very difficult because you don't really know the actual numbers that go to another province to study.
Yeah, but we definitely don't.
It's actually very large. It's actually very large for this kinds of courses.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks, Jeff and Paolo. Okay, we have time for one more quick question. Anybody has a burning question? Please raise your hand. Anybody? Okay, because it's already past 11 and we don't want to keep Paolo.
Pahabol.
Yes, Andy. Okay, one last question.
How about those? I don't know if I failed to capture this, but what about those nurses who go to other countries and then go to the US afterwards?
Yeah, that's very important. We don't have data on that, obviously, because we only have data on whether they migrated from the Philippines. But as you know, this kind of stepwise migration is, I think, a big phenomenon also, right? Like, so they first go to a different country, say Saudi Arabia, and then afterwards they go to the US. But during this period, because Caroline we also have this data on temporary migration. So we can see whether there was an uptick during this period in migration to For instance, like the usual places like Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, even the UK. But we didn't find any effects of migration to those countries during that time. But I mean, I think this stepwise migration is well documented, and so like we can't really say much about it, but yeah.
Thanks, Paolo.
Thank you.
Okay, so at this point, I'd like to invite everyone to turn on their video so we can have a photo opportunity with our speaker. So please, while you are fixing your hair, let me first invite you to the seminar next month. So this will be on October 13. So it's also Wednesday, but this time it's going to be at 4 p.m. And our speaker is Professor Yustun Kwa from Nanyang Technology University. And for those of you who are asking, the material, especially from seminar this morning, will be available in our website. And for those of you who are also asking for certificate, please contact us via email. If you attended on Zoom, then we may be able to provide you a certificate. So now